Faith over fear is not just a mantra, it's a mindset, a spiritual position, and a shield against the chaos that surrounds us. In a world where deception is currency and truth is treated as an enemy, holding on to faith becomes not only revolutionary, it becomes necessary for survival. It is not about belonging to a religion or a specific doctrine. It's about recognizing a higher power that exists beyond the manipulation, the lies, and the endless noise of politics and media. Faith becomes the compass, the guiding light when everything else is designed to confuse, divide, and dominate. When fear is pumped through every channel, fear of collapse, fear of disease, fear of war, fear of each other, faith becomes the only force that breaks through that psychological warfare. It reminds people that they are more than statistics, more than consumers, more than voters. They are souls. And those souls, when aligned with truth, become unshakable. That's the real reason the system fears faith. Not because it's outdated or irrational, but because it makes people uncontrollable. A person who is spiritually grounded doesn't cave under pressure, doesn't sell out for comfort, and doesn't follow the crowd blindly. Faith builds discernment. It clears the fog of propaganda and lets people see through the performance. You watch the news, and you don't just hear what's said, you notice what's not said. You question motives. You notice patterns. Faith doesn't make you naive. It sharpens your awareness. Because when you believe in something greater, you no longer rely on the promises of broken systems. You see them for what they are. Distractions from something eternal. That realization shifts your energy entirely. You stop panicking and you start preparing, not just physically, but spiritually. This kind of clarity is dangerous to the status quo. They don't want people operating from peace. They want people stuck in fear because fear creates obedience. People who are afraid are easier to manipulate, easier to divide, and easier to sell to. But faith doesn't play by those rules. Faith says, even if the world is burning, I stand firm. Faith says, I won't compromise what's right for what's easy. That kind of resolve scares the life out of institutions built on control. That's why they mock it, censor it, and repackage it into something sterile and palatable. But real faith isn't sterile. It's raw. It's disruptive. It speaks in a language that hits deeper than headlines. It moves people on a level that data can't touch. You've seen it before. Someone speaks with conviction, and suddenly the room changes. People get quiet. Some cry. Some shake. That's not charisma. It's truth backed by spiritual authority. It's rare, but when it happens, it bypasses the intellect and hits straight to the heart. You know it when you feel it. And once you feel it, you don't forget it. That moment, when truth and spirit meet, is where real transformation begins. It's not about convincing anyone with clever arguments. It's about waking people up from a trance. It's about breaking the spell of fear and reminding them of who they really are. Not just what they do or where they live, but who they are at the core, beings made in the image of something eternal. And that identity is not up for negotiation. It doesn't change with public opinion or political correctness. It's solid. And from that place of knowing comes power. Not the kind of power that controls others, but the kind of power that frees you from being controlled. That's the essence of faith over fear. It's the refusal to be swallowed by the darkness. It's the quiet strength that says, no matter what comes, I know where I stand. And when enough people hold that line, not with violence, not with hatred, but with conviction and clarity, the game changes. Systems built on fear begin to crack because they rely on mass compliance. They need you to be confused, distracted, and spiritually disconnected. But if you're not, if you're awake and aware, they lose their grip. And that's why this message is rising again. Because people are tired. Tired of lies. Tired of chaos. Tired of feeling powerless. They are searching for something real, something unshakable. And they're finding it. Not in institutions or influencers, but in the deep, often quiet recognition that faith is not weakness. It is their greatest weapon. When truth is spoken with sincerity, it doesn't just land in the mind. It touches the heart. Sometimes a message cuts through the noise of political rhetoric and media spin, and what remains is something profoundly human, deeply spiritual. That kind of moment doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's unforgettable. It doesn't need fanfare or theatrics. It doesn't rely on applause lines or carefully rehearsed points. It simply arrives with honesty, power, and the weight of something higher. That's what moved her to tears. Not weakness, not theatrics, but truth that hit too deep to ignore. Tears are often misunderstood. People see them as signs of fragility, but they're actually the body's way of releasing something that words can't contain. When truth and spirit collide inside a person, something has to give, and sometimes it comes through the eyes. That's what happened in that moment. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about strategy. It was a soul-level recognition that what was being said carried weight beyond the usual back and forth of public discourse. It reached into something sacred, and it pulled out a response that couldn't be suppressed. You can't fake that. You can't plan it or script it. You know it when you see it. A moment when someone is visibly affected by something real. Not spin, not slogans, but something eternal. When that happens, even the people watching from a distance feel it. The room shifts. The energy changes. It's as if time slows for just a second, and everyone present realizes that they're witnessing, more than a speech, they're witnessing truth in motion. Something bigger is happening, something that can't be explained away by critics or dismissed with cynicism. The truth is, many people are starving for authenticity. They're drowning in sound bites and staged debates. They hear a lot of words, but very few carry the kind of resonance that lingers. So when someone speaks not just to win a point, but to reflect something spiritually grounded, that stands out. It awakens people. It reminds them that not everything is a performance. Some things are real. Some words carry the power to heal, to convict, to inspire. And when those words are spoken, they demand a response. Not just intellectually, but emotionally. What she felt in that moment was bigger than ideology. It was an encounter with something sacred. And no matter how tough or composed a person may be, when they're face to face with something that aligns so perfectly with the truth they've carried quietly in their heart, the tears come. Not out of sadness, but out of recognition. Like a soul saying, yes, this is what I've been waiting to hear. It's not something you broadcast for attention. It's not a calculated display. It's raw. It's real. And that kind of emotional transparency is rare in public life. But it's also necessary. Because people need to see that it's okay to feel. It's okay to be moved by something that isn't about power or position, but about purpose. There's courage in vulnerability. And in that moment, that vulnerability wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough. It gave others permission to feel too. To drop the guard, even for just a moment, and remember what really matters. Not the headlines, not the polls, but the truth that transcends all of it. The truth that speaks to the soul and reminds us why we're really here. That kind of emotional moment, especially in a culture that prizes image and control, is a quiet revolution. It disrupts the expectation that strength means being stoic and untouchable. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to let the truth in, to let it stir something, to let it move through them without resistance. That's not weakness, that's alignment. Alignment with something greater than opinion or policy. Alignment with values that can't be shaken by popular trends or temporary victories. When someone speaks in that frequency, from the soul to the soul, there's no need to dress it up. It doesn't require volume or theatrics. The weight of it is enough. And when someone hears it and feels it, they know they're not alone. That moment of tears wasn't about emotion for emotion's sake. It was a spiritual echo, a signal. That truth had landed, and it was too heavy to ignore. That's not political. That's personal. That's divine. In every generation, there comes a time when people are forced to confront the reality that what they see isn't the full picture. The surface becomes too polished, too scripted, and behind it something darker is moving. That realization sparks a deep internal conflict. The awareness that we're not simply dealing with political disagreements or cultural debates. What we're witnessing is something more insidious. A battle between light and darkness, truth and deception, freedom and control. And that battle isn't waged solely in the physical world. It stretches into the spiritual realm, calling out that darkness is not comfortable. It's not trendy. It doesn't win applause from the institutions that thrive on silence and compliance. But it's necessary, because pretending that evil doesn't exist only gives it room to grow. And the kind of evil being exposed today doesn't wear a mask with horns. It shows up in boardrooms, newsrooms, classrooms. It disguises itself as progress, tolerance, and safety. But if you look closely, you see the real motive: control, confusion, and the systematic erosion of moral clarity. There's a reason the message about light standing against darkness resonates so deeply with people, because it names what many have felt but couldn't articulate. They've sensed that something isn't right. They've watched the distortion of values that used to be foundational. They've felt the pressure to go along with lies just to keep peace or avoid being labeled. But the truth always has a way of cutting through the noise. It doesn't need to shout. It simply stands, steady and unwavering, and forces everything else to reveal its true nature. That's why those who speak truthfully are often targeted. Because when you shine light into darkness, it disrupts the illusion, and those illusions are carefully constructed. Systems of deception don't survive exposure. They rely on distraction, division, and fear. But when light enters the room, people start asking questions. They start waking up. They start remembering who they are and what they believe. And that's the greatest threat to a system built on lies, a population that refuses to be manipulated. The reminder that the real fight isn't against flesh and blood, but against principalities and spiritual wickedness is more relevant now than ever. Because the battleground is not just in legislation or elections, it's in the hearts and minds of individuals. That's where fear is planted, where compromise is suggested, and where identity is stolen. And that's also where the light must shine first, within. When people reclaim their inner clarity, their spiritual discernment, they become immune to manipulation. They stop reacting to fear and start responding to truth. This isn't about blaming people. It's about identifying the forces behind the confusion. It's about recognizing that the rapid moral decline, the rise of division, and the attack on truth are not coincidences. They're part of a larger agenda that thrives when people are disconnected from what's right. That's why there's such hostility toward messages rooted in morality, faith, and conviction. Because those messages offer clarity in a world designed to keep people guessing. And clarity is dangerous to darkness. When someone names that fight and calls it what it is, something powerful happens. It gives others the courage to do the same. It breaks the spell of silence. It empowers people to step out of the fog and into the light. Not in a superficial, performative way, but in a deeply personal, grounded way. It's not about being loud or confrontational. It's about being anchored. Anchored in truth. Anchored in purpose. Anchored in a spiritual foundation that can't be shaken by public opinion or institutional pressure. There's nothing accidental about the times we're living in. The pressure, the confusion, the manipulation, it's all pushing people toward a decision to live in fear or to stand in truth. And standing in truth often requires calling out evil, not with hatred, but with clarity. That clarity doesn't come from ideology or intellect alone. It comes from being spiritually awake. And once someone is awake, they can't unsee the patterns. They begin to understand that every battle playing out in the world has a deeper, unseen layer that must be acknowledged. Light doesn't need to fear darkness. It only needs to show up. And when it does, everything hiding in the shadows has to respond. That's why messages rooted in truth, no matter how unpopular, carry power. They don't just inform, they transform. They remind people that evil only wins when good people stay silent. But the moment someone speaks, the moment someone says, "This is wrong and I will not be complicit," the tide begins to turn. Not just in institutions, but in the spirit of every person who hears that truth and dares to believe it. There is a deep longing rising in the hearts of people across the country, and it goes beyond politics, beyond economics, beyond anything that can be solved with a new law or a different party in power. What people are yearning for is not just change, it's restoration. They want more than a political revolution. They are hungry for a spiritual revival. because somewhere deep inside, they know that what's broken in the culture can't be fixed with surface-level solutions. The foundations have cracked, and unless we return to what made those foundations strong in the first place, nothing built on them will last. It's become clearer with every passing year that the problems we face are not simply political or social, they're spiritual. A nation doesn't just lose its way because of bad policy, it loses its way when it forgets who it is. And that's what's been happening. There's been a steady drift away from truth, from accountability, from values that once grounded entire generations. Families are breaking apart. Communities are losing trust. People are isolated, angry, and confused. That isn't just the result of bad leadership. It's the result of a spiritual vacuum. When faith is removed from the center, chaos rushes in to fill the void. People are waking up to this. They're realizing that what they really want isn't just lower taxes or better schools. They want meaning. They want something to believe in again. They want to know that the future their children are walking into isn't completely detached from the moral framework that once defined this nation. They want to raise their families in a culture that values truth over convenience, character over charisma, and conviction over popularity. And they're realizing that these things don't come from government offices or media platforms. They come from the soul of a people who remember who they are. That's why the call for revival is so powerful, because revival doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't rely on public approval. It starts in the quiet places, in the homes, the hearts, the churches, and the small gatherings where people drop the pretense and seek what's real. Revival isn't about spectacle. It's about repentance. It's about waking up from a spiritual sleep and seeing the world clearly again. It's about realigning with eternal truths that don't bend to political trends or cultural shifts. And that's exactly what this moment demands. Not just louder voices or stronger slogans, but deeper roots. Roots that can hold steady when the winds of confusion and compromise start to blow. Because a nation that forgets its spiritual roots will eventually forget everything else that matters. The freedom people cherish didn't come from government. It came from a belief that rights are given by God, not granted by man. That belief is what made freedom possible in the first place. And without it, freedom becomes a fragile illusion, easily taken and easily lost. So the real fight isn't about flipping districts or winning debates. It's about reclaiming the soul of the nation. That doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't come with a single speech or election. It comes when individuals choose to live differently, when they choose to stand for truth even when it costs something, when they raise their kids with integrity in a culture that promotes compromise, when they turn off the noise and get quiet, enough to listen to the still, small voice that leads them back to what's real. This is why revival matters more now than ever, because systems are crumbling, institutions are failing, people don't trust what they see anymore. And in that void, there is a rare opportunity, not just to rebuild what was lost, but to return to something better than what we had. A future, rooted in truth, guided by faith, and protected by people who understand that freedom is sacred only when it's grounded in responsibility and righteousness. What's needed is not more outrage, but more awakening. Not just action, but alignment with what's right and holy. That alignment doesn't just restore individuals, it restores entire communities. It brings healing where there was division, clarity where there was confusion, and strength where there was fear. It creates a culture that doesn't just survive, and it thrives. And it all begins with a return to the foundation that never should have been forgotten. In the end, it all comes down to this. What kind of future do we want, and what are we willing to stand for to make it happen? Because we're not just living through a political shift or a cultural argument. We're living in the middle of a spiritual crossroads. Every person, every community, and every generation has to face the moment when they decide whether to follow the crowd or follow their conscience. And right now, that decision has never been more urgent. We've seen what happens when truth is compromised for convenience. We've seen what happens when values are traded for popularity, when conviction is silenced for the sake of comfort. The results are all around us. rising division, collapsing institutions, and a culture that can't tell right from wrong. But the good news is, it's not too late. The foundations may be cracked, but they're not beyond repair. What it takes is people who are willing to return to what's true, not just in word, but in action. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about acknowledging that somewhere along the way we drifted and choosing to turn aqua. It's about understanding that revival doesn't begin in stadiums or on television. It begins in hearts. It begins in conversations. It begins in the decision to no longer let fear rule over faith, to no longer let the culture define what's sacred, and to no longer stay silent when the truth needs to be spoken. There's a power that comes when people wake up to their spiritual identity, not just who they are on paper, but who they are in purpose. That awakening creates courage. It creates vision. It creates a sense of mission that no system can control. That's what's needed now. Not just more noise, but more clarity. Not just more leaders, but more people willing to lead themselves, their families, and their communities back to truth. And for those wondering if one voice can make a difference, the answer is yes. Because every movement starts with one decision. Every revival starts with one spark, and every moment of truth begins when someone chooses to speak it. That's the real revolution. Not the one fought with slogans and spectacles, but the one waged quietly, powerfully, and persistently in the hearts of everyday people who refuse to let darkness win. So if you're feeling the pull, that quiet stirring that says something more is needed, something deeper, something real, listen to it. That's not weakness. That's the call. That's the invitation to be part of something greater than yourself. Not for fame, not for applause, but because truth matters, and the future depends on those brave enough to protect it. Now is the time, not next year, not someday, now, to stand, to speak, to believe, and most of all, to live like what's right still matters, because it does, and it always will.